Okay, everybody, welcome. We are tuning in, getting everything ready, making sure that my audio is working. We're making sure that our screens are working properly. Grab a seat, grab a drink, grab a snack. We're about to begin. Hi, everyone. Welcome to E-Decolonize number 14 with a guest lecture, Arnold from NewAmauta. We are going to begin briefly. I'm just going to set up my class logistics. So tune in, take a seat. This is going to be very, very, very intense, very much needed knowledge for our communities. So please let us know where you're watching us from. If you want to check in, let us know the city and state you're tuning in from. We always love to know where our students are coming from. All right, we have Jimena, Artemio, Light Entertainment. Welcome, everybody. Okay, let us begin. I'm going to start off with the introduction, and then you'll all get to meet Arnold, who is from NewAmauta. Everyone welcome Arnold. And here we go. I'm sharing my screen right now. Okay, everybody, welcome to E-Decolonize class number 14. This is going to be Inca philosophy with guest lecturer Arnold, creator of NewAmauta. Please follow his Instagram page. Amazing work. You're going to get to know more about him in just a moment. So it's recorded live Saturday, June 26th. We are here 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So welcome. It is our topic for today. To begin, just to let everyone know, I know we have new students tuning in today. What is E-Decolonize? It is a free online course to educate our community on much needed information, right? So basically we are merging activism, poetry, education, and academia to present knowledge and wisdom for transparent and updated decolonial approaches to our indigenous liberation. And we're using YouTube as a free platform to encourage accessibility and democratize education. This is really, really important to me as an academic, as an activist. Getting this information out in ways that are accessible to our people is #1 priority to me. And just to go over the basics, as you know, this is a safe space. And what that means is that this is an intentional space that centralizes Native Indigenous folks. This is dedicated to our collective learning through an interdisciplinary approach to decolonial knowledge. All ages and educational backgrounds are welcome. You don't have to register for this. All you do is like you did right now, just look up for the channel and here we are. I have a zero tolerance policy in my classroom. I have zero tolerance for hate speech, which includes anti-Indigenous, anti-Black, racist, sexist, anti-LGBTQ, two-spirit plus, colorist comments. They will be deleted and you will be blocked. There's no warnings. I'm sorry, we don't have time for that. There are many platforms that you can express that toxicity. This is not one of them. We have collective monitoring. So my students, you are empowered. If you see these comments, please screenshot them and then go ahead and block and delete that person. And if that person has questions, they can message me and we can discuss that. And lastly, donations, contributions. I do this as a free service for my community. This began summer of last year. However, any contribution is greatly appreciated. I do like to compensate all my guests for their time. I do not get paid in the summer. I work for the education sector, public sector. That's what happens. And I'm a new mom. So if you want to help in any way, shape, or form, I welcome it all with love and appreciation. And you can find me on, I have Venmo, Zelle, and Cashapp. So you can look at this if that's something that you're interested in doing. And as usual, we do have homework. So don't think you don't have homework. We have homework. It is the Google feedback form that I create for each class, because I'm always looking for ways to improve my content. I'm always looking for ways to improve my teaching approach. So I really appreciate if you can answer those questions on the Google form, especially for our guest lecturer. I will be sharing your answers with him. So this is a great way for us to gather information and to get feedback from y'all, right? We sometimes are not going to be able to answer all of your questions live. So this is a great way to have that conversation. And yes, if you are tuning in, please go ahead and let us know if you're comfortable with that, your name and where you are watching us from. It's really exciting to see where everyone is tuning in from. And here we go. Like I said, this is E-Decolonized number 14. We are going to be learning about Inca philosophy with Arnold from NewAmauta. And let me tell you a little bit about Arnold. I'm going to read his bio. So it's NewAmauta. Its pronunciation NewAmauta. Their pronouns are he and him. NewAmauta is a Quechua Aymara from Bolivia and born in the US. His Instagram page at NewAmauta is dedicated to the histories, philosophies, and heroes of all the nations of Abya Yala, which is North and South America together. Previous work done on the page ranges from indigenous Colombian philosophers to the Bolivian elections in 2020, the decolonial history of Peruvian constitution, to anti-colonial writings in Guatemala. Working primarily in English and Spanish with occasional use of Quechua, NewAmauta hopes to bridge the gap in indigenous knowledge between Anglo-North America, US and Canada, and Latin America. The methodology used is known as hemispheric settler colonialism. This refers to how settler colonialisms in Anglo-America and Latin America have shared characteristics of building nationhood upon indigenous genocide, which is assimilation, massacres, segregation, ethnic cleansing programs. Whether it is breaking treaties and extermination campaigns or mestizaje and educational assimilation, the goal of settler colonialism in English and Spanish is to erase the Indian and take the land. Having a BA in both philosophy and comparative religion, his research has been dedicated to the importance of indigenous philosophies, religions, and their application to the problems in the 21st century. Climate change, sustainable development, indigenous divinity, multinational states. His focus is on Andean philosophy, mainly from Bolivia and Peru. Just to let you know, I first learned about NewAmauta when I was watching the podcast called Indigenous Podcast, led by two relatives, Juan Choloa and Marcus. So please look at their podcast, amazing work they're doing. And when I first heard of him and his knowledge on, he was explaining things and breaking things down, I said, you know what, I need to have him on here. He needs to come share his knowledge with the students here on E-Decolonized. And so with that, I'm going to kind of let you know what the structure is going to be for the class. It is going to be about an hour and a half class. This is a once in a month college course. So we're going to be going in deep. He has a lot of information for everybody. So we're going to do introduction. The lecture he's going to present is about an hour and 15 to an hour and 20 minutes. Then we're going to get into questions and answers and closing remarks. And also, if you want to support NewAmauta tangibly, he has three ways that you can contribute to him, and that's Venmo, Cash App, and PayPal. This is going to be available to you after the class course, so you can always come back and see his handles. And he also has them on his Instagram page. And like I said, reflection, you have homework. If you can, it would greatly appreciate it. And next month, we are going to have a class in the Spanish language for the very first time. A lot of people have been asking me. So next month, this is what we're going to cover. Historia decolonial de México. En el lenguaje español hablaremos sobre la conquista, el mestizaje, mexicanos blancos y la resistencia. All right. So with all that, let me go ahead and stop my share. And Arnold, let us know. Let me get this. It is all yours. Thank you so much for sharing space with us.
Thank you so much, Citlalli, for inviting me. I'm really glad to be here with all of y'all. I'm a Quechua and Aymara who was born in the U.S. but family from Bolivia. So to introduce myself properly, Imanay Kasangichek, Wagesni, Panasni, Nyogaksuti, Arnold Arnes. Hello, how are you all? My name is how are you all? My name is Arnold. Kolesuyu Mantakani. I am from Bolivia. The original name of Bolivia is Koyasuyu, and the whole point of this lecture will be to decolonize what we think of as philosophy, and not only that, but understand that there is a long and intrepid history of Andean philosophy that stretches back at least 500 years. And even before that, you have the anthropology of the anthropological work on the Incas that seeks to uncover many of the principles and structures that guided indigenous thinking and governance, even before 1492 and before the Spanish conquest in 1532 in Peru. So what we're doing here is a long and very difficult job because in essence, it is condensing 500 years of philosophy into about 80 minutes of runtime, and then questions and answers, of course, which I very much welcome. But it is also a work that I would have preferred to have done over multiple classes. But what I hope to do here is with Citlalli's platform is to not only teach Andean folks in the diaspora, since this lecture will all be in English, but also to share knowledge that we have in the Andes for people outside, for indigenous folks outside of the Andes, those in Mexico, those in Guatemala, those in Chile, in Argentina, in Brazil, in the U.S., in Canada, because we have one of my goals is always to create a new indigenous intellectualism. The same way in Europe, many people learn about French, German, English, Swedish, Russian, and have this pan-European type of intellectualism. So too should we know that there are multiple languages, histories, philosophies that we need to know of the Americas to make ourselves not only self-sufficient, but also philosophically independent from the colonies that have ruled over our lands for about a half a millennia. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and present to you my project, which I've been doing over a month here, 500 Years of Inca-Andean Philosophy, from the Inca Empire to the Plurinational State. And please do follow my page, NewAmauta, at NewAmauta on Instagram. I do also have a YouTube page, but I don't put anything on it. Instagram is definitely a lot more easy for me, as I'm much more of a writer than a video producer. But then again, being a professor, I have to use every medium I can, or being a aspiring professor, so to say. So without further ado, let's begin. The outline of the entire project will be 6 topics divided over about 80 minutes. The first one, I forgot to press play. The first one will be the Inca Empire. So we're going to be studying some of the main concepts that existed amongst the Incas that may have gone into many of the post-Inca Quechua and Aymara societies that exist now across Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia. Then we'll go into the chroniclers, specifically Elinca Garcia de la Vega, who wrote the seminal text, Royal Commentaries of the Incas and General History of Peru, where he describes the view of Incan history from the perspective of the nephew of an Inca. He was the nephew, I believe, of Manco Inca, who was the ruler right after Atahualpa's death. And then we'll go into independence, where we'll be comparing different visions of what it means to be independent in Latin America. In this way, we're going to be comparing Tupac Amaru, Tupac Katari, and Simon Bolivar. So we're going to see what is the Andean version of decolonization and independence compared to the one pushed forward by Simon Bolivar and his Enlightenment liberalism. This will go up to 1825. And yes, there is a huge gap between 1825 and 1910, as there is a big gap between the chroniclers and independence. There's a lot of history there too, which is very understudied. However, there's not enough time for it. But at some point, I hope to actually explain what those points are. They're usually less understood. They're usually less studied due to the fact that indigenous culture was much more dominated and institutionalized within the colonial system, or in the case of the post-independence period, institutionalized into the colonial republic of Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador. So we're going to be jumping into indigenismo number 4, better said indigenismos, in which we will look into 3 specific authors who describe different visions of what indigenismo is. One from each country we're describing, Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador. And then we'll be jumping into the agrarian reforms, an all too understudied period amongst the diaspora, where the intellectual history of indigenismo pushed forward a solution to the Indian problem. And the solution was to give back the land and to end the colonial system, to create authentic republics that included indigenous peoples as much as the criollos and mestizos. Is this a project that was completed and was completely ethical? No, but it is a project that should be understood in the context of our own contemporary period, where land back is a project that is being pushed by natives in the U.S. and Canada, that recognizing the treaties under colonial governance is one in which is a fight that has been done previously in Latin America about 70 years ago. And boy, do I have to tell you, there are a lot of problems with the structure, and there are indigenous peoples who both praised and also criticized it. So in this agrarian reform period, we're going to be seeing primarily the indigenous views of what the agrarian reform is. And finally, we're going to be jumping towards plurinacionalidad, or multinationality, which means how did the modern Andean nation states begin to shift from mono-ethnic republics to plurinational intercultural states that recognize multiple indigenous and ethnic nations under one state, as well as how did this process work within, comparing it somewhat with the pink tide, as well as the Peruvian elections now, where Pedro Castillo is president, but also he has yet to be inaugurated, but how his policies and the policies of many on the decolonial left in Peru called for the shift of Peru from a republic to a plurinational state. So we have a long history to go through here. And most importantly, let's see. Oh, excuse me. We're going to be pushing into, beforehand, I do want to say this. We need to understand what Andean history is. When we describe what Andean history is, we're not talking about Andeans talking about Hegel, Kant, Rousseau, Marx, Adam Smith. When we describe what Andean history is, we're describing philosophies and politics that are structured within an indigenous way of thinking, both inspired or deeply ingrained into. Either these authors assimilate themselves back into indigeneity, or inspired by certain ideas but never make the claim of being indigenous. Usually they're mestizos or criollos in this case. But the importance of this distinction, where it's not just, in the case, in a simple case, or in a very popular case, we have someone like Frantz Fanon, who is a Martinican, a Black Caribbean author who described the structures of colonialism. His claim to grace was he created one of the most potent critiques of the psychology of colonialism, which is required reading in every anti-colonial, third world, and even indigenous, and even studies on indigenous and colonized peoples in the university system. However, one critique that is often not made of him is that he is a Black anti-colonial writer who modifies European thinking to meet the needs of Black folks in the Caribbean. But what he doesn't do is create a critique from African or from Caribbean ideas, Taino, or different African like Igbo, Yoruban ideas. So in essence, he falls into what many authors in the Andes try not to do: be a copy, a very radical, but a copy of European thinking. If there is indigenous thought already, why not return to that, and not, instead of just repeating Marxism or repeating capitalism with an indigenous face. So we'll be divided. So the majority of the works we're going to see here are divided amongst two categories: the political and what I describe as the metaphysical. The political is are texts that are based around the colonial condition, in which indigenous peoples see themselves as part of republics or as colonies, in which they are not only the oppressed, but also have a yearning to remove the colonizer and not just be included, and to in some ways bring back the anti-colonial structure prior to, or maybe build a new one based on indigenous thinking at that moment in history. One example we'll see of this is of Tupac Amaru. But another example that we'll see in terms of the metaphysical, in this case we won't see this one, but we have Jose Uriel Garcia, who's also from Cusco, just like Tupac Amaru. And his philosophy is of the land creates the essence for humanity, and from there each humanity is based on which land that they're a part of and the specific environment in which they live, and how divinity can be how that sort of relationship with the land is tied to a divine view of how the land works, which is a common theme, a common structure, a religious spiritual structure that exists across the 500 years of Andean history and philosophy. And it's one that's resurrected, or one that's replayed in Uriel Garcia's text during 1930 in his book El Nuevo Indio. But he also says that the metaphysical is the basis for the political, because from there, indigenous peoples, the concept of indigeneity and the concept of nationhood is no longer based on, are you indigenous, how much blood do you have, but is one that will irk some people, but and I do not agree with it completely, but it's one of our relationship to the land, and that there is a certain deterministic principle that the land hold and power that it has on people born on top of it, and that even mestizos and criollos, people who have criollos who may not have any indigenous blood, can be more indigenous than actual indigenous peoples by relating to the land better and by assimilating to its to the culture that is born from naturally from the land. Now, this is a philosophy that is all too deterministic, and we won't be describing it here due to time constraints, but the essence of it is that the political and the metaphysical play hand in hand in much of Andean philosophy. Whereas following Kant, the metaphysical was seen as outside of the possibility of rationality, because our human perception could not perceive, had limitations, and thus could not perceive what is divine or beyond the world, as in God is beyond the world. We cannot perceive him. So we should try to focus on a rationality, on an ethics, on creating ethics and structures of humanity, structures within humanity that are within the limitations of human perception. For the Andes, there are different conceptions of spirituality, but there's also not that emphasis of the metaphysical is beyond our pale, beyond our focus. Rather, the two fuse together. The metaphysical focuses Andean philosophy, Andean politics, by having a mythological view of the Incas, and the metaphysical guides the political, as in the land will affect how the land is divine and powerful and will affect what type of politics are possible. So this common theme, this theme is what makes some of the best decolonial philosophy, and why Andean philosophy is so interesting, and why it has so much similarity with even the philosophies in North America, among the Haudenosaunee, or among the Lakota, or among the Cherokee or the Muskogee. So without further ado, let's go into part one. The Inca world. What are basic ideas? This would be divinity, duality, community, divinity, and reciprocity. Oh, let's not forget ecology. So to begin, we're in the Tawantinsuyo age. What is Yanantin? Why are we starting with this? Yanantin is the Quechua word meaning the unity created amongst partnership. And it's the guiding ideology for authors like Javier Lajo, who just recently passed away about a month ago from recording this. And in his book, El Capacñan, La Ruta Inca de la Sabiduría, it is the first principle, that of complementary duality between opposites. So Yanantin, Yana is, to break it down, Yana means partner. Yana as a noun means partner, but as an adjective means black. However, the two meanings, since Quechua is a polysemic language, the same word could have different meanings that don't intertwine with each other. So there's no reason to connect the two in this case. As a noun, it means partner. And intin is a suffix added onto yana, which is not so much a plural, but it is a grouping together. In the case of another word, kimsantin, where the word kimsa means three, kinsantin means that group composed of three people. It is this, the individuals are turned into a singular composed of individuals. Now, the importance of the Yanantin is that it creates a worldview that is divided amongst two, high and low, above, below, earth and sky, left and right. In a more old view, in like an old school view, male and masculine and feminine, the ground and the water, mountains and flatlands, rushing water and still water. In a similar sense, you have the Tao in China with Taoist philosophy, the yin and yang. And in this case, the two opposites that can kind of encompass this would be Lyoke and Paña. Lyoke means left and Paña means right. And the world is divided between left and right, not politically, just in terms of direction. An example of this would be Pachamama, who is the earth goddess, but also the goddess that gives life. All things come from Pachamama. All things grow from it. So it is the telluric, meaning earthly divinity. Whereas Viracocha or Pachacamac, two ways to describe the creator god, is an Uranic or a heavenly divinity. And it is the confluence between the two that creates life. For Ángel Avendaño, a Cusqueño philosopher, he describes it as such. El Pachacamac se vierte a los hombres a través de la Pachamama. So humans are created through Pachamama by virtue of Pachacamac engendering life into them. Kamak in this sense, to translate Pachacamac, it means the animator of the world. In this case, you can say that Pachamama represents the material and Pachacamac represents the uh, essence or the soul. So where does the individual fit into this structure? Well, there is no individual, or there is an individual, but there are different types of it. In Quechua, there's the word sapa, meaning a single person. But there's also the word chulia, which Ariel Carmona Cruz, another anthropologist, a Quechua anthropologist from Cusco, describes as an unpaired person. And in his studies of the Queros and of Quechua anthropology, he relates chulia to wakcha, meaning orphan, abandoned. So the importance of differentiating a chulia from a sapa is that a sapa could be someone who's solitary in that moment, but a chulia is someone who is disconnected from relationality itself. In essence, there is once you are chulia, you are not you are unpaired. You have no opposite that you're engaging with. In many ways, it can be seen as the example of how philosophy now is done. I am the in a Cartesian sense. Descartes described, "Oh, I think, therefore I am." In the Andean sense, if you reach the point where you can strip away all of reality in meditational exercises, you're distancing yourself away from reality and making yourself chulia, which means you're solitary, infertile, and impoverished. You are unrelated and unable to create both value and life. And it is the lowest, one of the lowest points of Andean history, to be unpaired, to be without community. A division of this could be there, and Aurelia Cormona Cruz makes the divisions in this structure. He divides this past as Lyoke, the present as Paña, the darkness as left, light as right, the feminine as left, masculinity is on the right side, infirmity is on the left side, health is on the right side, decadence on the left, abundance on the right. The color silver is on the left, and the color gold is on the right, as well as the water, like waters from springs, are on the left, are feminine, and on the right, waters from glaciers, from runoff from mountains that come down from glaciers, that's masculine. And on the right, we see a depiction of Yanantin, how Yanantin is compared to the Hunapku in the with the Mexica and the Maya and the Tao in China. That there's always the opposites. There's always the opposite within oneself. Within me, there's a bit of you, and within you, there's always a bit of me, and we're always in constant movement with each other. And harmony is built on that constant movement, in which opposites are not always in opposition to each other. You are dark, so there is darkness in this world, so we must cleanse it all with light. Without light, there is no darkness. Without darkness, there is no light. Rather, the importance is not to cleanse the world of the opposite, but to work in harmony with it. And those who try to distance themselves from this harmony are the ones who are living in quote evil or badness. But something interesting that we can see also is that in the Andean worldview, the mountains are considered masculine, and this is for all of my trans folks, non-binary folks, two-spirit folks. This duality may not seem like it fits for you, but but the thing about philosophy is one ought be creative. One should be creative with the ideas to describe reality. And one thing that's very interesting is that Pachamama, the female earth goddess, grows the Apu, the mountain deities, which are masculine, outside from its body. In some ways, the masculine and the feminine are put together, one in the other. They're in that masculine, the masculinity comes out the feminine, and are bound together. In some ways, it can be A relationship could be between in the Andes, that Pachamama has a penis. The earth goddess has a penis and is as much fertile as the mountains are. And there you go. We have the beginnings of a trans-Andean philosophy within the metaphysical structure. And I'm hoping this opens up new possibilities for all of the non-binary, trans, and two-spirit Kariwarmis inside the video, inside the lesson right now. But we spent plenty of time on duality. Let's go to the second structure, the Aleu, which is the basic economic building block of the Incas. So what is the Aleu? It is the grouping of nuclear and extended families together. It's like a clan, different families coming together to create a self-sufficient structure that ties itself to a single ancestor that could be mythical or real. But what's most important is that people are related to each other, and that must always be real. Like we said, the idea of being chulia is being unrelated to beings, and to be chulia in a world where there is no industrial technology means you probably die. It's the same way as being in exile. In pre-modern societies, to be in exile was the same as being in death, or being sentenced to death, because you no longer could grow, be part of the agricultural community that could provide you food, clothes, and shelter, meaning you were at the mercy of the elements. And in this case, and beyond that, for the Andes, to be the individual was very ephemeral, meaning the most basic economic unit was the Aleu, the family, the clan, the community. And the communities could be divided amongst Hanak and Uray, meaning there was a higher structure and a lower structure, depending on which side of the family you're from. And the way Aleu, and there is no word for family in the nuclear sense. There is only Aleu. So if you're asking someone, are you like my family member? Aleu chukanki. Someone could say manan. No, I'm not part of your family. But that's the difference between a nuclear and an extended communal family in the Andes. And for Waldemar Espinosa Soriano, the Aleu was deeply connected, emotionally connected with with the land that they were on, and even described it as a family member, either a sibling or that the land was a sibling, or that the humans on the land were children of the land. And this goes into the earth-based philosophy of worshiping Pachamama and always being in relationship with the natural world. Next, we have the three worlds of the Incas. There is the Hanak or Hanan in classical Quechua would be Hanan Pacha, Kai Pacha, and Uku Pacha. But in modern Quechua, it would be translated as Hanak Pacha, or the upper world, Kai Pacha, this world in which where we all inhabit, and Uku or Uray Pacha. I've seen both translations, meaning the inner or the underworld. Not hell or heaven, but the underworld in which things are in darkness, but not in pain, not in suffering. Hanak Pacha interacts with Uray Pacha through lightning and rain, which in some way within the classical sense would be the sky is inseminating Pachamama, which creates the life that is born above. The roots that people pick, that is the union between Hanak Pacha and Uray Pacha. In another sense, and like lower Pacha, the Uray Pacha is also represented by tubers, by the potatoes, by yams, and by different root vegetables. Kai Pacha, however, is the world we see every day. Those streets we walk, our perspective from the sky, our perspective looking up at the sky or looking down to the ground. All of that is Kai Pacha, and that's the world for all animals, for most plants, animals, mountains, and us. The symbolic representations of Hanak Pacha would be the condor. In Kai Pacha, it's represented by the puma in the Spanish conquest symbology. But in the post-Spanish conquest, many communities represent Caipacha as the bull or as the cow, a waka. And in the lower world is represented as the snake or Amaru. And there are early, and like as I said earlier, there are early confusions between the Christians and the chroniclers, in which heaven, earth, and hell are divided amongst the three worlds of the Incas. But that's not true. There was no suffering hell, and heaven was not this paradisoidal realm in which you live for all of existence. Finally, there's in Cusco, you have three realms. Some communities in Cusco don't recognize these three realms. Rather, they just divide Pachamama into three different structures, as in three types of Pachamama. There's Pachañusta, meaning world princess, Pachatierra, meaning a sacred land, and Pachavirgen, meaning also sacred virgin, or Pachañusta in this case would be sacred princess. And you could read that more if someone had access to this in a library near them, in Bernabe Condori and Rosalind Gao's book Caipacha. Finally, we're going to unite all of these concepts together in the structure of Tawantin Suyo. What is in Tawantin Suyo's economic structure of ecological complementarity and verticality? Yes, I can hear the moans and groans. What are these idealities and like 7-syllable academic terms? They'll make sense and they're very interesting. Well, verticality one is that the environment in the upper Andes, in the mountainous region, is one that makes moving from one place to another very difficult, because to move from my position here to maybe a position 10 blocks down would mean I'd have to walk down the mountain as much as I'm walking 10 blocks in distance. Whereas on a flat plane, it'd be easier. It's just a straight line. Rather, in the Andes, it's going from above to below and then walking straight if there's a valley below it. So this created a problem for which the Incas had a solution on how to survive. They recognized that to gain resources, they did not have to move from to different areas, but rather to different ecological planes based on altitude on the mountains. So at the high mountains, the Puna or the Altiplano, you have the most barren and high wastelands, the ones that are cold, lacking trees, sometimes, and might not even have most grasses that you would find even like at like 8,000 feet, because the Puna would be about 10,000 feet or above. In other cases, in the valleys, you would be able to, whereas in the Puna, you could grow llamas, alpacas, you can raise them, you can grow potatoes. You would be able to find other other resources like potatoes or like salt and corn in the valleys, or coca in the lowlands, so moving towards the Amazon. And in this way, verticality, the importance was of conquering or of living based on how the mountains provided for you based on its height rather than on its length. And this is a theory developed by John V. Mora, who was a very influential anthropologist of the Andes. And one of the other concepts is of ecological complementarity, that there is a structure between the Incas with their environment, that the Aleu that one lived in had a separate Aleu, a satellite community outside of its highlands in maybe the valleys or even in the lowlands. And those communities were used to to grow resources, grow crops or animals that could not survive in higher lands, and then take those resources back to the main highland community. And one of the principles of this was to each according to their ability, to each according to their need, because those who would move, because it would take days to walk the distance between these two communities, many working men and women had to leave their families behind, meaning the community had to raise their kids. And in that way, that would be, or tend to the crops that they were growing in their home up in the mountains. And the community would take care of the crops and would take care of the kids as payment for this community member going into the satellite community in the lowlands or in the valleys who are growing corn and will bring it back for all people in the community. In this way, there's a reciprocity between the high and the low communities, between those who live in the highlands and those who, and the migrant, and you could say migrant laborers who are moving between the satellite and the main community, as well as in terms of labor. I bring you corn, you take care of my kids. I bring you coca, which doesn't grow in the altiplano, and you will take care of my crops. And there is the practical application of complementarity in Yanantin in Inca civilization. So we don't have much time. We have 5 more parts to go. Let's go into the Misisa Chroniclers, which I will focus on one here. And the main source is, the main topic will be to study the worldview right after the conquest and the development of what is an Incanist myth that will transcend Andean history, even to us today. So here we have Elinca Garcilaso de la Vega. He is the son of a Spanish conquistador and a Inca noblewoman, and was born in 1535, 3 years after Pizarro conquers the Inca Empire in Cusco and captures Atahualpa. Elinca Garcilaso's main claim to fame is that he wrote the book Royal Commentaries of the Incas and General History of Peru, which he wrote in his, I believe, 60s, but he described an Inca view of history, since Elinca Garcilaso was a direct descendant of the Inca nobility, and his uncle was Manco Cápac, who was an actual Inca, the Inca that followed Atahualpa and was a puppet king to the Spanish. And he would hear stories from him, which he would actually write down in this book in 1607 and 16, I believe, 11 or 18. And the Incanist vision, and what's important is that this Incanist vision is one that is from a Quechua nobleman. And one thing we're going to have to describe here specifically is that the myths that exist within Elinca Garcilaso's book are not false stories. Rather, they're stories that show a specific type of value that is being emphasized, a way to relate to the world. The same way people might relate to, this may be a bad example, but like Harry Potter to describe politics today is a similar way in which myths were stories that try to explain certain ethical principles or certain characters in a plot line, in a kind of simulation of life that showed people how to live. Now, don't go reading Harry Potter and trying to understand 21st century politics. Please don't. You will most certainly get it wrong. But in the case of Elinca Garcilaso, he described a utopic vision of the Incas, in which the Incas had built a civilization in which it was clear that in which there was no hunger, no homelessness, and no poverty, in which the Incas were wise rulers who were able to command a wide empire and treat each ethnic group with the respect that they deserve. And in comparison, and in a 15th century lens, it was a utopia. For us, it might not be as grand as it might not seem as grand, but it was most certainly influential and still resonates in our minds today, as the Incas are an indigenous communist society, if you would say that. Also, the book is the beginning of Andean literature. It creates the tropes and the allegories and the myths, as well as the basis for how to understand Inca history, an Inca worldview in world history. The book was written in Spanish and was written with in Spanish literary in a Spanish literary genre. And it shows in how Quechuas, Aymaras, indigenous peoples could engage within world literature, but also provide a history for their own people. And it's been studied by dozens of authors. Elinca Garcia is probably the most studied Andean in Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador. But his works would influence Tupac Amaru, would influence the indigenistas, would influence anthropologists, and would even and still on some levels influences well-educated indigenous peoples now who are learning about Inca history. Though many anthropologists claim that his make claims that his works are somewhat fantastical, exaggerated, they show how Incas view themselves in relationship to their into their in their position in the world as one of noble and ethical kings. And one way we can see this is that Elinca Garcilaso says before the Incas, the indigenous peoples were barbarous. Once the Incas governed, civilization arrived. And then following that, there was the Spanish conquest, in which the main grace that they brought was Christianity. Their governance is bad, but Christianity was good, according to Elinca Garcilaso, which I don't agree with. But uh, what we see here is that he describes a distinct view in which the Incas are bringers of civilization. Now, for any Ecuadorians who have heard stories from their indigenous folks, they know the Incas could have been pretty brutal to their peoples. The other chronicler we're gonna go through quickly is Felipe Guamán Poma de Ayala, and his book is El primer Nueva Crónica y Buen Gobierno, which is a text written by a nobleman outside of the Cuscoan family. And the main importance of his book is that he creates these elaborate and beautiful woodcut drawings to describe both Inca life, Inca relationships with the Spanish, and even the Inca worldview. One example is this Mapa Mundi, this world map, in which Cusco is at the center of the world, and everything is divided amongst the four suyus, or the four territories and lines that created the Chinchay Suyu, Koya Suyu, Anti Suyu, and Kunti Suyu. And you can see how the world is divided amongst those four regions, which were the four regions of Tawantin Suyu. And then on the outside, you see the horizon in which the mythical creatures exist, and then the divine beings of the sun and the moon are right there, and the mountains are at the outskirts, showing the divide between here and the outside world. In many ways, it is an indigenous transformation of the medieval maps, in which the center of the world was always Jerusalem. In this case, it was an indigenous view in which Cusco was the divine center of the world. Let's move on. Now we're at independence. We're skipping ahead about almost 100, 200 years, about 180. Now we're going to just see Tupac versus Bolivar. Let's go. So Tupac Amaru and Michaela Bastidas. Why do I conclude the two of them together? Well, another principle of Yanantin, working together. Tupac Amaru was a curaca, or a chief from the region of Tungasuca in Cusco. He knew Quechua and Spanish. Some people describe him as an indigenous man. Some others describe him as a mestizo. But what matters most is that he led the indigenous uprising in Cusco, in Peru. And his army was built on indigenous, mestizo, criollos, and African peoples. His army was built this way to accommodate the wide population that existed in Peru, but also were strategic. In many cases, he had called for an indigenous for African unity, because he understood that, one, slavery bad, because of course, but also to weaken the slave economy, which was focused in Lima. He declared that Africans would be free in a world ruled by him, hoping that enough African slaves would run free to join his army, and crippled the slave economy in the coastline, especially in Lima. This was, I believe, in a November 16th letter in 1780 or 81. Uh, for indigenous peoples, he provided the end to the mita, and which was a labor tax, the end of the repartimiento, which meant which was another labor tax in which indigenous peoples were serfs and could be traded amongst different communities based on the owner of that community. Uh, the the work tax in Potosi, in which indigenous peoples from Cusco were made to walk from their homelands all the way to Potosi in Bolivia to work in the silver mines, in which it's estimated about 8 million peoples lost their lives. And then and then also many of the taxes paid to priests would also be abolished, as well as the end of colonial governance, the end of bad colonial governance. There's controversy amongst this. Some say that Tupac Amaru wanted an ethical protectorate ruled by him, but he would still be under the Spanish crown, or that he wanted to rid the Spanish altogether from his land. In Charles F. Walker's book, the Tupac Amaru Rebellion, which I recommend everyone read, he argues though that Amaru was not a fan of bad governance, but was still wanted to be part of the Spanish Empire, though many others disagree. He believed in Incanist governance, which he gained after reading Elinca Garcilaso de la Vega. Elinca Garcilaso de la was read commonly amongst many of the elite chiefs and children of chiefs in Jesuit schools in Cusco, and it described many of the histories of indigenous conquest, of wise governance, of a world without poverty and hunger, and it influenced Tupac Amaru, who, mind you, was named Jose Gabriel Condorcanqui beforehand at this point. And in many ways was the influence for him to try to reconstruct the Inca Empire, in which the position of Inca would come back, and the Spanish viceroy would be removed from Peru. And he claimed this because he had royal blood stretching back all the way not to Huayna Capac, but to Tupac Amaru the First. Excuse that error. He traced himself right back to Tupac Amaru the First, who is also directly related to Huayna Capac, so it's not completely wrong. But this Incanist governance of a second Tawantinsuyo, which is also another theme, brought fear, both political and cosmic, to priests. One priest describes how indigenous peoples gave up their reverence for the priesthood, for Spanish institutions, and were rebelling in a town of his. And he said that this was the eve of the end of the universe. It's a similar sentiment to how the indigenous peoples felt when the Spanish conquered Tawantinsuyo, beheaded Atahualpa, and instituted the Pachacutic of the indigenous peoples are no longer the center of the world. It is Spain that is the center of the world, and Tawantinsuyo and the Incas were dethroned. In this sense, the political and the cosmic are fused together, both in the Spanish sense here, as well as the Quechua sense of a Pachacutic being a mythical and political overturn of the established order. Ultimately, and also we have Yanantin, meaning there was a feminist leadership between Jose Gabriel Condorcanqui and his wife Michaela Bastidas Puyukawa. Michaela Bastidas was also a wealthy Quechua woman in Cusco, and she was actually his right-hand commander, and even led a contingent of the army outside of Cusco in preparation for a siege that they were planning. And in the Cusco campaign, there were many fears that Michaela Bastidas would invade and conquer Cusco, and that she was renownedly feared for being as strategic and more arrogant than her husband. She's what you describe as a badass. and someone that every feminist and Quechua woman should really look into. She's an amazing figure. But there were disagreements between the two. In the Cusco campaign, Michaela Bastidas did not know whether or not Michaela Bastidas said that they needed to conquer Peru, conquer Cusco immediately, while Tupac Amaru wanted to wait for a people's uprising in Cusco to invite him in as king. In the end, Michaela Bastidas was more strategic and tactical, because by waiting, by them waiting, the Spanish were able to create enough reinforcements to bring them in and keep them from losing the city. Now to move on to Tupac Amaru and Bartolina Sisa, who are also another example of Yanantin. Julian Apasa, who named himself Tupac Katari, and Bartolina Sisa, his wife, were both Aymaras in Bolivia. And we're going to go through this quick. They're very similar. There's Yanantin. Bartolina Sisa is the top commander for Tupac Katari. There was a view of colonial governance needs to end immediately. Indigenous peoples are uprising, but there were key differences. Unlike Tupac Amaru, Katari's rebellion, the Kataristas, decided on more of a racial clash of civilizations, in which it was a war between the indigenous and the Caras, and Aymara meaning white person. And the indigenous leadership was headed by Katari, and the majority of the ranks were indigenous as well. This did not mean that criollos, mestizos, and Africans were not a part of the army, but they were so in lesser numbers. And there was much less trust of the criollos who Tupac Amaru would actually engage with on a daily basis before the rebellion, because he was a merchant and interacted with the upper classes of Cusco and improving society in general. Tupac Katari, however, is somewhat of an Aymara Incari. Incari is a myth in Peru describing the beheading and the separation of the Inca from his body, that he was dismembered and beheaded. Gruesome pictures, which I will not show, but and that once the body was buried, there was a point there's a mythical view that the body will reconstitute itself, and once the body comes back together, the arms, the legs, the body, and the head, then the indigenous peoples will rise up again and become Tupac Amaru and Tupac Katari, and finally realize their independence and their decolonization. Katari did not view himself as an Inca, but rather viewed himself as an Aymara peasant, because he had no royal bloodline and he was extremely poor, unlike Amaru. But there are actually myths that were born out of Tupac Katari, that following his death, many people in Bolivia now revere Katari. There is a bigger, and Bartolina Sisa as well. I think even more so than Tupac Amaru is revered in Peru by both mestizos and indigenous peoples. One of the ways you see this is in 2006 and 2008, Aymara peoples realized a ritual symbolically reconstituting Tupac Katari and Bartolina Sisa's bodies. The men did Katari's body and the women did Sisa's body, showing Yanantin, or in Aymara, showing the principle of Chachawarmi. Chachawarmi is the same thing as Yanantin in Aymara. And this shows the way in which Katari's rebellion, which was equal in scope to in terms of the size to that of Amaru's, and how it created a new mythological line in which, if for the case of Amaru, the starting point was the Inca Empire. For Katari became the starting point for Aymara mythology of a return back to Katari and his rebelliousness. This is most seen by his famous call when he was being drawn and quartered by horses, in which he said, "Volveré y seré millones." I will return and be millions, which was also said by Tupac Amaru, I believe, in which he was drawn and quartered So was Amaru. And it showed a similar fashion to how uh, Atahualpa was decapitated and separated from his body. In each case, they became the myth of Incari, of the body dismembered and coming back together in a future time, is a myth that is upheld amongst indigenous peoples even today in Peru and Bolivia. And interestingly enough, in Peru, people said, I am already millions, with the 8 million peoples who voted for Pedro Castillo, the majority of them being indigenous. So now we have to compare this to Simon Bolivar. What's most important about Simon Bolivar is that he did not come from an indigenous background, and he in some ways was antagonistic towards them while being while also wishing to end the colonial system. Simon Bolivar, as everyone should know, was the leader of the Latin American independence, South American independence movement, and he liberated 6 countries: Venezuela, Colombia, Panama, Ecuador, Bolivia, Peru, and Bolivia. Now, we're going to look at one of his famous quotes, which comes from his Jamaica letter, which I recommend everyone read. There are translations in English. He says, "We do not retain vestiges of what we were in other times. We are not Europeans. We are not Indians, but a middle race between the indigenous peoples and the Spaniards, Americans by birth and Europeans in right. We are placed in an extraordinary predicament. We have to maintain ourselves in the country where we were born against the efforts of the original invaders, while at the same time disputing with the natives our privilege of possession." So there's a lot to unpack there. Let's go. The mestizaje is the primary goal of Simon Bolivar, whereas Tupac Amaru and Qatari had indigenous views of how to govern Peru and Bolivia. Simon Bolivar viewed America as so far gone in terms of mestizaje that an authentic revolution could not come from indigenous peoples, but needed to be one that was neither European nor indigenous, but mestizo, the middle race. He says here, we are Americans by birth and European in rights, or Europeans in right. What he means here is that they are American as in born in the Americas, but they are European in terms of their institutions, in terms of their legal system, and in terms of the way they view themselves in the world. Basically, it could be said that they are brown people with a white mind, and they are placed in an extraordinary predicament that they are both in war with the original invaders, the Spanish in Spain and the king, as well as the natives of the Americas. He does not differentiate between the Criollo royalists and the indigenous peoples. He says his version of Enlightenment liberalism and mestizo Latin Americanism was the one that needed to win out from both sides. In many cases, would he have united with Tupac Amaru? I'm unsure. I would believe so, but in the end, he would have had his view of mestizaje is the more popular and the more dominant one amongst colonial thinking today. And his other idea was La Patria Grande, of uniting Latin America. Whereas Tupac Amaru and Qatari wanted, or Tupac Amaru in this case, wanted to unite the Inca Empire back, seeing in which he actually recreated certain campaigns the Incas had done while reading Elinca Garcilaso's book. Simon Bolivar had a grander vision, which to his benefit is actually much larger because it sought to unite every Hispanic country from Mexico all the way down to Chile and Argentina. He excluded Brazil because it had a monarchy, and though it's unsure whether or not language had to do with the separation as well, but also he did not include Haiti or the United States, mainly because of the language barrier. But he has one more view of the United States in his Carta al Coronel Patricio Campbell, which he wrote in 1929, where he describes that that the United States will grow to be, by providence, a country that will plague the Americas under the name of freedom. That it will be an imperialist country that will say, I am liberating you. Many people took this as a prophecy, but rather it was an intelligent an intelligent and strategic view of history, because 6 years prior to him writing this, um, the Monroe Doctrine, declared by James Monroe in 1823, had stated that Europeans could no longer invade the Americas, because while Europe is on the other side of the ocean, the leader of the Americas would be the United States, and all other territories are effectively protectorates. In some ways, this people say this is the United States overstepping its bounds, being kind of like a barking tiny dog to giant mastiffs. That it had in 1823, it had no power to stop most Europeans from invading other countries. But what it also pointed to was that the United States had its own goals of holding hegemony, of holding absolute power in the Americas, whereas Europe can stay in the old world, which in some ways did realize itself in the late 19th century with the colonization of Puerto Rico, of the attempted ones of the DR, the invasion of Cuba, and many of the policies overthrowing governments in Latin America in the 20th century. So now we have to jump into indigenismo. We're only in part 4, and it's been an hour. Indigenismo is, I write as indigenismos, because there's not just one indigenismo. There are multiple ones that developed across Latin America, and especially in the Andes. The indigenismo has a bad connotation in Mexico because it's usually associated with the assimilationist policies of the state, even under Lázaro Cárdenas, though but less so. But we're going to study different versions of indigenismo. One that is assimilationist, one that is mystical, and one that is revolutionary. But they all focus on the Indian problem. What does it mean to resolve the Indian problem? What is the Indian problem? That indigenous peoples are in a wretched condition because of the poverty because of which causes them to be backwards. But not everyone agrees as to why. Also, to say that they're backwards, pretty colonial. But essentially, that they used to be Incas, they used to be great civilizations before the Europeans came. So what can we do what can a mestizo or Latin American country do to resolve the problems of indigenous suffering? Essentially, that was the point of indigenismo, and everyone had a different solution. The main solutions, though, were education and land. So we have Franz Tamayo, who is a Bolivian author, and I consider the mystical type of indigenista. He was his main text was La Creación de la Pedagogía Nacional, or creation of national teaching or pedagogy. And the main thesis of the book is that Latin America is too inauthentic in the way it develops its education, and especially Bolivia. That Bolivian scholars and thinkers have not scientifically understood Bolivia enough, and in doing so, they've started to copy and do poor copies of European technologies, education system, and especially philosophy and science. Tamayo called for rejecting this, for rejecting European ways of thought, not because he didn't like them, but one, European education did not work. We're not Europeans. Two, European education was merely grew in certain conditions that misunderstood how Bolivia could be a leading country in the world. Essentially, Bolivians had to create their own form of thinking, their own form of thought. And Tamayo divided the world between 3 races: Indians, Cholos, which is the same as mestizo, and white. And for the Peruvians, you'll be interested to see what he says about Cholos. What Tamayo says about indigenous peoples, first off, is that they are the leaders of Bolivia, that they are the ones who built Bolivia, the ones who make it run, and the ones who provide the what he calls the national reservoir of energy, the national reserve of energy, that they provide both the will and the physical material power to create all of Bolivia's institutions. The white folks are the intellectual part, but they're parasitical. They exploit indigenous peoples, demean them, and but take of their labor, and provide little to nothing to Bolivian culture, mainly because it's inauthentic. They just go to France or the United States or England and copy their models or fawn over the old Spanish Empire. The Cholos, on the other hand, are he considers as peoples who are both confused for being a mixture between indigenous and white cultures, but also following into the same exploitative view of indigenous peoples. That Cholos, many of them are indigenous peoples educated in a white system, or actually mixed by, like culturally and biologically, who view themselves as needing to exploit indigenous peoples. And in this way, Tamayo praises the Indian as the leader of Bolivia and as the model in which all people in which Bolivia should construct itself. That is a country of will, power, and an active development. The reason why is this mystical? Another part of the book, he describes the land as a creator of cultural of society, just like Uriel Garcia. This is what Franz Tamayo says: the land makes man, and in this sense, he is not only the soil on which that he makes prints on, but also the air that he breathes and the physical circle in which he lives. And he says that the earth makes man, and in the land, one must find the ultimate reason of thought, the ultimate purpose of thought, of work, and of morality. Tamayo's view was that indigenous peoples, in their way of thinking, that the land creates um, society, the same way that the Aleu saw that Pachamama was the mother, or maybe even sibling, but mainly the mother of culture and of that Aleu. So too did Franz Tamayo integrate that view into how national society is built. That indigenous peoples are the creation of the land itself, that they are the indigenous culture, that indigenous people's culture is the natural culture to be born out of the terrain of Bolivia. And it is through the study of the land and of indigenous peoples, their ways of thinking, their psychology, and in some ways their culture, that one could find higher truths within the world, ones in which we relate ourselves to nature and to ultimate truth. And this is a theme that goes into his mystical and philosophical poetry, which is much less read. So now let's go into Mariátegui. Jose Carlos Mariátegui is the revolutionary, and he's from Peru. He is also a mestizo like Tamayo, but he does something different. He says that, so whereas Tamayo says the problem of indigenous peoples is that they have an inauthentic education that comes from Europe that doesn't understand them and then misattributes one's relationship with the land. Mariátegui is a Marxist, and he traveled to Italy, learned Marxist from Italians during the 20s, and then returned back to Peru, excuse me, to and studied in Lima and created the first socialist party in Peru. And he said that the problem was not education, but the problem was land, our relationship to economy, and that the economic structure that exists in the countryside exploits indigenous peoples to the point in which they are no longer able to participate. They are segregated from society, and are exploited to the point of basically serfdom, and that a new education would not actually solve that problem, but would just make it would just be a liberal reform that would prolong its survival. So the problem was the economic basis, which is a common Marxist thought, proposition. It is mostly true, but there's still something wrong with it. And I know all of the Marxists are going to get mad at me. And you know what? Of course, I'm not a Marxist. I'm an indigenous, and many of the indigenous critiques of Mariátegui are so developed, like dearly or so undearly underread. But the problem is comunalismo, the economic system in which a landholding elite, a system that can trace itself back to the first haciendas by given to the Spanish conquistadors in the 1500s. This system of owning literal territories, literal ayllus and communities, in which indigenous peoples can be traded to different communities. That is the problem that keeps Peru from becoming an authentic nation as much as creating a socialist revolution. So what must be done? He says that Inca communism shows the way forward. Not that we must return to Incan communism. He says we can't return to it. We can't return to an agrarian utopian society, but rather it shows that indigenous peoples not only are capable of are capable of leading Peruvian society, but doing so in a communist way. If they had done it 500 years back, they could, or in this case, 400 years back, they could most certainly do it again in 20th century conditions. But he said that it must be done with the specific conditions of Peru, which is of an industrializing society, and one in which Peru needs to consolidate itself as in some ways, a proletarian country. Indigenous peoples were the proletarian, but they would do so through their own farming and factory jobs. So Inca economics proved the basis for industrial communism in Peru, which is why many consider him the Incan communist, even though he rejected returning back to the agrarian communism of communalism of the Incas. Little tidbit though, the Soviets rejected Mariátegui up until 1930 when he died, not because of any poisoning, just because he was sick. And they rejected him due to because Mariátegui viewed the Soviet Union as misunderstanding the conditions of Peru, and that a socialism that was built in Peru needed to be Peruvian, not just a mere copy of Marxism-Leninism, which was the one headed by the Comintern, the Communist International. And once he died, many people see his death as a turning point in activism in Peru, because the leading communists that he built up rejected Mariátegui and started to remove his theories from their doctrine. In essence, just they valued Lenin and Stalin and removed Mariátegui, in some ways becoming a copy, which was the main criticism that indigenistas made of European ideologies, no matter how radical they be. And it's the point, and following the 30s, it's the point of decadence for much of the communist movement in Peru. Finally, we're in Ecuador with the institutionalists. I'm sorry, Ecuador. There are many other indigenistas, but I chose him, Pío Jaramillo Alvarado, because he is the most prominent indigenista in Ecuador. What we have here is someone who also proposes that the problem within the Indian problem is a problem of land. He makes the liberal view of it, though, and he does it before Mariátegui, whereas Mariátegui publishes his text, 7 interpretive essays on the history on Peruvian reality, in 1928. Pío Jaramillo publishes his book El Indio Ecuatoriano in 1922, 6 years before Mariátegui. And he goes beyond someone like Tamayo and says the problem is of land, not education. But he says there needs to be legislation to end the serfdom of huasiponcos, which is the Quechua word for house doors, which is the term used to describe indigenous serfs, slaves. But he said we needed to break up, but Jaramillo argued for the breaking up of the land and monopoly, the gamonalista class, but not redistributing land back to indigenous peoples, but rather bettering the conditions by making them more regulated rather than completely abolishing the economic system itself. But El Indio Ecuatoriano, due to the fault here, not due to the fault here, is still a primary text, and Pio Jaramillo is considered the father of sociology in Ecuador for his masterful understanding of the indigenous condition, both in its economic, political, social, and cultural development and suffering in the 20s. And the book would be republished over and over again. But he's the institutionalist not just for that, but also because he declares he's an architect of state indigenismo in Ecuador. In 1940, he traveled to Pátzcuaro, Mexico, to attend the first Pan American Indigenista Conference, headed by Lázaro Cárdenas, which detailed indigenista policy for all of Latin America. In that From that conference, and he was the representative, Pio Jaramillo, of Ecuador. And in 1943, he inaugurates the Instituto Indigenista del Ecuador, which proposed policies and studies of indigenous communities so as to better their conditions, but never going so far as to say we need an indigenous revolution because we're indigenous. Unlike someone like Mariátegui or even someone like Tupac Amaru. However, he does indigenize on some levels, like many indigenistas do, and declares that Atahualpa is not only a national figure of Ecuadorian culture, but also influences someone like him to connect on some level with indigenous peoples. That Atahualpa wanted to create a local, a secondary, another capital in what is now Tomebamba, Ecuador, I believe in Cuenca, and that Tomebamba would be a dual capital to Cusco, the same way Constantinople was the dual capital to Rome, and that Atahualpa viewed himself more as a Cuencano, as a Tomebambino, than he did as a Cusqueño, and for that reason, he is a figurehead of Ecuadorian culture, both national, indigenous, as well as indigenista. So even this institutionalist goes farther than the fawning Europhile liberal of the earliest 20th century. So now we're at the land reforms. We have 15 minutes to go. And oh boy, we got much to do. What we're going to do here is describe the positive and negative critiques of the nationalist revolutions in Bolivia, Peru, and Ecuador. Since we described much of Peru, we're going to focus more on Ecuador and Bolivia, but we're still going to mention Peru and great materials for you to study. So we're describing the land reforms in Ecuador, and we're going to focus on the figurehead of Chancito Amaguaña, who is a Quichua woman, an indigenous woman from Ecuador, who led many of the early indigenous movements during the 20th century. Most famously, she's one of the founding members of La Federación Ecuatoriana de Indios in 1946. If I'm wrong, someone can correct me in the comments. The importance of Amaguaña is that she is both a female leader, but she was also a member of the Communist Party of Ecuador and used the party and its organizing capabilities to push for a land reform, an agrarian reform in which lands were given back to indigenous peoples. The importance of the of the agrarian reform is that it was actually established. She was a staunch supporter of ending gamonalismo, and agrarian reform policies were passed in Ecuador in 1964, Ecuador, and again in 1971 or two. In Bolivia, in 1953, following the nationalist Bolivian Revolution of 1952, and then in Peru in 1969 by Juan Velasco Alvarado, who was a Peruvian military. He was a leftist Peruvian military dictator, and he instituted the Peruvian nationalist revolution. Now, in the case of Tránsito Amaguaña, she did live to see the land reform, and in her interview, in her 1977 interview, titled "Hemos sufrido, hemos lidiado, hemos luchado toditos," she supported the end of the gamonalista system and was and the end of paying taxes, exploitative taxes to priests, seeing that as a culmination of much of the activism she had done for about 40 years of her life up to that point. However, in Ecuador, there were disagreements of the land reform. The CONAE, the Confederación Nacional de los Indígenas Ecuatorianos, I forget the entire, excuse me, Ecuadorians for forgetting the entire acronym, but the CONAE says that the land reform did not complete what it had to do. It was a half-measured reform. And for someone like Tránsito Amaguaña, it also did come about that. She did not receive the lands she should have by 1984 and began to move away from supporting the agrarian reform. But most importantly, though, about Tránsito Amaguaña, one more note is that she worked with Dolores Cacuango, who was also another indigenous Quechua woman who was also part of the Communist Party and a member of La Federación Ecuatoriana de Indios. So the FEI was a precursor to the CONAI now and was a center, a hub for indigenous activism in Ecuador. Now, quickly, we're going to go through Peru with the amazing figure of Saturnino Huilca Quispe. I recommend Saturnino Huilca. I recommend looking at all the materials here. Saturnino Huilca Quispe is a Quechua from Cusco. He was born in an hacienda in under an abusive gamonal in Cusco. He became a labor organizer, and during the 50s and 60s led what are called invasiones de tierra, or quote land invasions, which were indigenous peoples organizing surrounding a gamonal's house or community, or the community that he owns, and demanding that the gamonal renounce his title to the property and give it back to the indigenous peoples. Of course, it's people say that Huilca Quispe is like the Gandhi of Peru for this nonviolent method. Didn't mean it was complete. It was like pacifist and non-militant. No, but he was very much someone who used the threat of violence to give back land to indigenous peoples in Cusco, and he is seen as one of the architects of the land reform movement across Peru. That's how effective his methods were, and he was seen as one of the major syndicalist leaders, one of the major labor organizers in all of Peru by 1969. And there he is holding the hand of General Juan Velasco Alvarado, who is the leftist military general that overthrew the president in 1968. And General Velasco, instituted the land reform in 1969, calling for two reasons. He feared that the land reform movement, led by indigenous peoples, could result in a communist-style revolution, just like in Cuba. But also he saw that there were necessary reforms that needed to be made, very progressive and national reforms that needed to be made, so as to protect Peru from a bloody revolution. And he was a very progressive leader, more so than even many of the elected ones, or probably more than almost all of them. You can watch and read more about this in the famous and incredible documentary released in 2019, La Revolución y la Tierra, which you should Google. La Revolución y la Tierra en Hicha. They have the movie online. It should be on their Facebook page or a link there. And then there is Hugo Neira's Huilca habla un campesino peruano, in which Hugo Neira interviews Huilca and Huilca provides much of his life story and work throughout, up until 1974. if it's only released in Spanish, so if someone could get into contact with the author Hugo Neira, because there's probably someone who knows how to, please tell him to release the Quechua version of the book. He's old. Before he passes away, it would be great for Peruvians to have a Quechua Spanish bilingual version of Wilca's words, rather than just a Spanish one. Reminder: he never spoke Spanish. He was an illiterate, monolingual Quechua speaker, and was able to lead much of southern Peru on that fact alone. So I recommend looking into both of them. They're both incredible figures in Peruvian history. Finally, we're here at Bolivia with Fausto Rinaga, a hardcore indigenous intellectual. He's a Quechua Aymara, born in the countryside of Oruro, I believe, or Potosi, and he develops a unique ideology known as Indianismo, in which he says that European thought in the Americas only sought to colonize indigenous peoples and never spoke to the real conditions or culture that indigenous peoples developed, and that and unlike indigenismo, which was led by mainly led by mestizos, Indianismo was led by indigenous peoples with indigenous thought and an indigenous anti-colonial critique. Fausto Rinaga was a Marxist before, and this is something interesting, and what I like about him, he's a very interesting figure for that fact. He gave up his Marxism because he saw it as ineffective to understanding the real condition of Bolivia. In essence, Indianismo saw Marxism as much as capitalism as a colonial ideology that did not understand indigenous peoples and their needs effectively. Rather, he looked towards Inca communalism as a basis, as an economic basis for a decolonized Bolivia. But he was also, interestingly enough, influenced by Black power. In his book La Revolución India, which is considered the Bible of Indianismo, he cites directly Malcolm X, Stokely Carmichael, Franz Fanon, who's again Caribbean but a major figure in Black power in the U.S., and Martin Luther King Jr. So those figures influence, and MLK may not be Black power, but he was definitely influential within Black intellectualism at the time. And Fausto Rinaga was influenced by all of them and cited them very dearly. In some ways showing the Black influence, the Black American influence in a place as far off as Bolivia, as Collasuyu. I recommend looking into that. There is an article online about it. And Rinaga was also influenced by indigenismo, by figures like Mariátegui and Luis Y. Valcárcel, who we did not get to talk about here, but who is a dear author of mine. And Rinaga made the distinct change from Marxism, that the struggle is not about class or land, but it's racial and colonial, and that it was divided between indigenous peoples and white folks. And that interestingly enough, Rinaga did say that mestizos chose to be white, that they could choose to return back to their indigeneity, coming from the voice of an indigenous intellectual who was born in the countryside, and he himself having a bloodline, having a royal blood connected to Tomas Catari, who was a leader of the Catarista, one of the leaders of the Catarista rebellion in the 1700s. So you can't get more indigenous than that. But the Indianista critique of the agrarian reform here is that the land reform was for the cholaje. In Bolivia, the word cholaje is the same as mestizaje. But that it was done by the mestizo criollo elite to end the suffering of indigenous peoples, but to develop the nation state at the cost of the indigenous peoples. He doesn't say indigenous, he says Indian. And like all indigenous peoples, we should respect the different names we have for our peoples. And for someone like Rinaga, he despised the word indigena because he viewed it as connected with the movement of indigenismo, whereas Indianismo was more fiery. Even though it was wrong, it was more fiery and was the original word that united all the indigenous peoples on the continent. So he uses Indian very clearly, Indio in Spanish, And he does so with reclaiming the word. So we respect that. So Reinaga viewed the way the land reform was done as another form of colonization, because it ended the private property. It ended the communal aspect of the indigenous economy in the countryside. That it was made that the Gamonales, their lands were split up, their authority was removed, but the lands were parceled out into individual or into nuclear family type organizations, which meant that the communal aspect of the land reform resulted in indigenous peoples becoming more individualized and not more Incan communalized, which he had hoped. Another one was that the national economy, um, inculcating indigenous peoples into a capitalist form of production, meant that they were removed from the communal aspect, but also the education of it. That the land reform should have bettered the economic condition of indigenous peoples, but still did not provide enough, was half done and not done with indigenous voices at hand, which meant that indigenous peoples were still poor, were still so poor that they could not receive a proper education or the resources to have a school nearby. So for this reason, Reinaga goes beyond Mariátegui and says the Indian problem is one of power, of Indian power, poder indio, he says, not of land. Because if it was of me, because if it was just of land, returning the land in whatever condition would have allowed indigenous peoples to thrive. However, it was one in which indigenous peoples had to do the land reform themselves so that it could be properly done with indigenous peoples in mind. So for those looking into land back, this is a very interesting case study to think into. Plus, Fausto Naga's Poder Indio was influenced by the literal cry of Black Power in the US. So all these connections are very important in a transnational study of indigenous peoples. Now we're at the last section. We're going to get this done in about 8 minutes, I hope, hopefully less. And we're going to go into the 20th century with plurinacionalidad, interculturalidad, and the philosophy of buen vivir. So what is plurinacionalidad? Well, it's the idea, simply put, of there being many nations in one state. That the critiques that have developed from the 500 years of indigenous servitude was that at every point indigenous peoples were not equal, but also when they were attempted to be made equal, they were done. It was done through a process of assimilation. What plurinacionalidad, or in English, multinationality, plurinationality meant is recognizing both the equality of indigenous peoples, but the differences that they choose to have based on their own culture. Indigenous peoples essentially are people with specific special rights, as African people have certain special and specific rights, as do certain mestizos, immigrant groups, etc. That there are multiple nations that are protected under one state, rather than the process of assimilating everyone into mestizo nationalism. Everyone's mixed here. Everyone's a mestizo. So we must remove your languages, your culture, your claims to land, and provide for security for the mestizo nation state. No difference. If there is no difference, there is no threat to the nation state. The definition here that Luis Macas Amboludi, a former president of the CONAIE, and a Quechua Saraguro lawyer, said is he connotes what plurinationalidad means. Construction of the plurinational state consists in recognizing the cultural, social, and political diversity of our peoples. That is to say, excuse me, the error there, recognizing the presence of multiple nations inside the nation state, millenary cultures, civilizations that have existed for thousands of years, incorporated into a state that was born only 179 years ago in the case of Ecuador. Basically, indigenous peoples precede the nation state. So why must they assimilate into it? The critique then is of decentering the mestizo or even the criollo perspective of why the nation state exists as it does. and essentially puts the history of Ecuador before its creation, putting it centering indigenous peoples in what it means to constitute a nation state. In this case, a plurinational state. The author, I forgot to, excuse me for not putting this here, but the author Navidad Gutierrez Chang described a progression of history into the plurinational state. That Latin American history is one in which the 17th century or the 18th century was one in which Latin America was dominated by colonies. Then, following independence, there was the republic of the nation states that developed across Latin America, Mexico, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia. During the 20th century, there was a point of consolidation, of unifying the nation state by resolving certain quote contradictions, which culminated many times in the land reform movements and the nationalist governments that existed across Latin America, most strongly in Peru with Juan Velasco Alvarado, Bolivia with the Movimiento Nacional Revolucionario and the Bolivian National Revolution, and in Mexico with the Mexican Revolution, and then with Lázaro Cárdenas as president. And in the 21st century, there is the development of the plurinational state that recognizes the many indigenous nations and their specific claims to their own land and certain laws that do not have to be assimilated into the nation state. The most important case study would be Bolivia, but there's also the 2008 Ecuadorian constitution, as well as the 2021 Chilean constitution, which is being drafted right now, that would turn Chile into a plurinational state. And in Peru, there is the president now, Pedro Castillo, whose party Peru Libre ran on turning Peru into a plurinational state, rewriting the constitution by popular referendum, and then changing it into one that recognizes all indigenous peoples. If you want to learn more about Peru's discourse on plurinacionalidad, I recommend reading the Planes de Gobierno, the government plans that both Pedro Castillo's Peru Libre made and Verónica Mendoza's Juntos por el Perú, their Plan de Gobierno. They're both online in the link below in this slide, but also I recommend reading the Plan de Gobierno that was released by Pedro Castillo during the second round of the presidential elections, which was drafted following conversations between Castillo and Mendoza during May of 2021, and also includes certain language about buen vivir, about plurinacionalidad, and interculturalidad, which we'll look at next. Though he does not know, though the document does not cite plurinacionalidad specifically, which is a sad fact, but hopefully Castillo has not turned his back on that, but we'll see in the coming months. Now we're going to look at interculturalidad, which we can amount to as indigenous Spanish dialogue. That the definition of interculturalidad, according to Carlos Mamani Condori, who is a member of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues to the UN for Bolivia, he is an Aymara intellectual. Mamani describes it as education has become a battlefield between those groups that seek to preserve the privileges of the colonizer language, whites and mestizos, and indigenous peoples who push towards policies of interculturalidad and dialogues between civilizations, between systems of knowledge, etc. Essentially, interculturalidad is decentering Spanish and mestizo ways of thinking in Latin America to provide equality, but also specificity with how indigenous languages are taught. One example would be Bolivia's 2012 law of linguistic rights and policies. In this intercultural policy law, all government officials must learn an indigenous language. They must learn Quechua, they must learn Aymara, they must learn Guarani, they must learn Mojeño, they must learn It's any other language. But it's not. But Bolivia, some would say, is an Aymara nation. Not everyone must learn Aymara. If you're living in the Amazon, you don't need to learn Aymara. No one. Aymara is not indigenous to the Amazon. The the uniqueness of interculturalidad is not that there is an indigenous and Spanish language that are national languages. Rather, indigenous languages are taught based on the region, based on the locality in which they are situated. In Cochabamba, people speak Quechua, so a government official will learn Quechua alongside their Spanish to provide resources to all of the Quechua speakers there. In La Paz, people will learn Aymara, but there is a region in North La Paz that speaks Quechua, a remnant of the Inca conquest during the 1500s. Does that mean that you must learn Aymara in those communities? No, one would presume that in those communities you would learn Quechua, even though you're in a state, in a departamento that's primarily Aymara speaking. And that's the uniqueness of plurinacionalidad. In a place like Santa Cruz in the eastern lowlands, you would learn Guarani. The many indigenous languages there are so varied and sometimes bordering each other that it depends on each municipality and each town. And interculturalidad tries to make that specificity the bulwark for its decolonizing project. That no indigenous person is excluded, that there is not one indigenous language above all the rest, nor is Spanish going to take that place. Everyone must know the language that corresponds to where they live. And that, I think, is a very interesting project in a place like the US as well. And by government officials learning the language, it allows indigenous peoples to have access to resources which they could not access due to the language barrier, due to them not knowing Spanish. Finally, we have the last slide of the presentation, and it is, I believe, and it is my favorite one of my favorite philosophies of summa causae. It's not the only 21st century ideology, not even the other two were. But it is one of the most popular ones. And summa causae translates to living well, or vivir bien in Quechua. Essentially, it is this. There is an indigenous ecology, that ecological way of thinking, but also one focused on a divine view of humanity in relation to all beings. It is a return to the old indigenous ways of thinking, to the Incan ways of thinking, in which one is always in relationship to land, to the divinities, to the gods, and to the animals, plants, and environment in which one lives. It is both political and mythical in that sense, metaphysical. But in it, I must have messed up the slide here. Excuse that. But one of the main ideas of the whole of this ecology is that one is always in relationship to all of the living beings in the environment, and that this ecology must create a harmony in which there is no being that is above the rest, and if there is a certain hierarchy, humans are not above it. And for this reason, summa causa is neither capitalist nor socialist, but indigenous. It's not. It rejects capitalism, because capitalism centers human wealth and human effort on creating money, which is a process of living better, of which can become cancerous in how it begins to destroy both the environment and human societies. Look at climate change as the most obvious example. But summa causa, and in this case David Choquehuanca, also criticizes Marxism, even though he's part of a socialist government. By the way, people should look up David Choquehuanca. He's an amazing figure in Bolivian politics. He rejects Marxism for being anthropocentric and for removing a certain relationality with nature. Marxism still holds the view that dominating nature is essential, but that domination is focused on redistributing the resources plundered from it equitably. All humans will live equally at the cost of nature. In it would be the main argument. But also the relationality of how do you have a spiritual relationship with the gods when when Marxism removes that possibility for a purely materialist viewpoint? But this does not mean Summa Causa loves capitalism. Summa Causa moves towards an indigenous communalist system similar to the one the Incas had, and it is one that is considered a universal ideology because it is being used by indigenous peoples in the Americas and being debated both in Europe and in Latin America as an ideology that could teach, that could decolonize and solve many of the problems facing facing colonized and colonizing societies. Um, a specific quote that David Choquehuanca writes in his book El Manifiesto del Buen Vivir, or del Vivir Bien. And I will try to provide the titles for all of the texts that I reference here, and though they should be in the description below at some point in the future, in the near future. But to end here, what Andean philosophy can teach and what is being done with Summa Causa is one example, is what David Choquehuanca says here. Los pueblos milenarios somos los guerreros del arco iris y que tenemos que impulsar el retorno al camino de la vida, de la hermandad, la armonía y la paz en el mundo. The millenarian peoples, we the millenarian peoples are the warriors of the rainbow that have to push forward a return to the path of life, of fraternity, of brotherhood, of harmony, and of peace in the world. Essentially, Buen Vivir, it reverses the colonial project where Europe sought to civilize indigenous peoples with Christianity, with liberalism, with Marxism. Now, indigenous peoples are beginning to look at themselves as their own, quote, civilizers. That this quote, which came from David Choquehuanca's vice presidential speech, which I recommend every single one of you to read. There is a link in English if you look it up, is saying Andean philosophy can teach the world how to return into harmony with nature and into harmony with its own political systems. And that indigenous peoples are very well adept at being able to resolve these problems on a world historical and world philosophical level. And that this history that I've provided to you now hopefully will provide a basis for your own study, which it's a very thin introduction, but I hope it provides the stem for you to branch out both the roots and your branches and find new authors that you will find in the Andes that will advance your own education and decolonize your way of thinking. Thank you very much. This was a wonderful presentation. It took much longer than I expected, about 20 minutes more, but I'm very glad I was able to give this. One last thing, though. I have a special announcement which I was working up to. So so this is me. This is NewAmauta. And what I'm hoping to do is provide an actual class in which I can go into depth with all of these ideas in a 6-week course starting on August 1st, where I would have 2 sessions. One on August 1st, every Sunday around probably is sometime in the morning, and then a second session, which would go through the same topics on August 2nd, every Monday night for people who are working. These will go into the same topics that we discussed, but also go deeper in different questions that we haven't dug into, such as what are the views that Atahualpa had of the Spanish colonizers when they arrived? What are the different indigenista authors who called for a return to a second Inca empire? Questions like, oh, what are the other 21st century philosophies in the Andes right now? What other decolonial philosophies are critiquing Summa Causa and see it as ineffective? What are the ways in which Miquela Bastidas developed, was feared as a warrior in the campaigns in Cusco? What are the different ways that Tupac is viewed in Bolivia? What are the different what are the different rebellions in Ecuador that happened during the 20th century, during the Indigenista period, and during the land reform period? All of these questions will be answered during these classes, which will begin in a month, and they would be 6 weeks. I'll provide more details on my Instagram page at NewAmauta, and I recommend giving a check to my dear friend, to Brian Arnez, who was the one who developed this beautiful flyer that is recreating the Inca stonework based in Cusco, and who made the very beautiful text based on that type of very masonry block style text. So I really recommend checking his website out, brianarnezdesign.com, and his IG handle, Brian Arnez Design. He was very gracious with providing his work for me for this announcement. And I hope every one of you joins the class and either DMs me personally or fills out the Google form, which I will provide in about either tonight or tomorrow. Thank you very much for joining this class, and I really hope you got something out of it. And I'm sure for many of the Andeans who are here, you did.
Thank you so much, Arnold. Thank you. That was massive, super, super exciting to finally get some type of information regarding our relatives in Tawantinsuyu, the Inca, Peru, and Ecuador. I'm sure a lot of our students really, really enjoyed it and benefited from your class. I don't know how you feel. I know you've gone on for about 2 hours.
Yeah, pretty much.
But go ahead.
This might be your longest lesson, I believe.
I think so. I think so. I was disconnected. I don't know what happened, and I was able to come back into the meeting, so I'm happy about that.
Okay,
but
that's good.
We have a couple of questions that people have been asking, and I gathered a few. I don't know if you want to answer some. What I did is created a Google Doc with the questions, so you can kind of read them yourself to see what you would like to cover based on how you feel right now. I know it's been a long lecture.
No, I can answer them, but for people, but I would also want to see the doc, because certain answers I might be able to provide better answers outside of the stream too. I'll try to answer everything here so that people who watch the video get the answers, but I do want to give personal answers to these folks as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me go ahead and share my screen.
Okay.
So I have it already ready.
There we go.
And awesome. Thank you so much.
No problem.
And let me go on. I think it's this one. Oh no, it's not that one. Hang on one second. I was collecting them as people were writing them. Okay.
Could you can you expand that?
Yes. Can you? Yeah, I want to make sure you could see it.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So the first question is, what is your opinion for Pachamamismo, which is the false indigenism that Evo Morales' government, the government of Evo Morales' actions show, creating ceremonies that don't exist or never learning Quechua and Aymara? Yeah, there are many people who are known as Indianistas and Cataristas in Bolivia who criticize Evo Morales for this, quote, Pachamamismo. Pachamamismo, for those of you who don't know, is a name given by both indigenous but also some critical mestizo philosophers in Bolivia to try to say that, oh, they're just worshiping Pachamama in a very surface level and kind of in a purely aesthetic way. There's no substance to it, and it's the name to deride the philosophy of buen vivir in many cases. I wouldn't say that Evo Morales' government is purely Pachamamista, if we're to use that word. Many of his policies, many of the push for plurinacionalidad, for interculturalidad, were major steps in Bolivia's history. They provided a case study and a real and a substantial change to how how indigenous peoples view themselves in relationship to the plurinational state. But then again, Evo Morales is criticized by many Indianista Cataristas for being more of a syndicalist leader. He was born his political career was born in the countryside as a cocalero, as a coca grower, and a major syndicalist leader there. He was not an Indianista or Catarista at any point. But it also shows the flaws of like labor organizing as a basis for decolonizing, because he could focus on many of the material conditions that Bolivia has, but on some levels he also is creating a type of some could say a false state ideology around him. But there are also a lot of indigenous peoples, or a lot of new indigenous philosophy that describe Evo Morales in a very interesting way. Like there's the book Illapa de Huiracocha, which I have up here, which is a book by Eusebio Gironda, and he describes Evo Morales' victory as a sort of celestial victory. That Evo Morales' victory into the as president is a metaphor for Illapa, the lightning god, um, casting down anti-colonial judgment and recreating order back into the world. So even if Ebo himself isn't engages in sort of this aesthetic of indigeneity, there are indigenous philosophers and like anti-colonial philosophers who are making very interesting new philosophies about politics and fusing the mythical and the political, um, based on based on the symbol of what Ebo means for indigenous peoples, rather than who Ebo is, like in terms of just his politics or in terms of who he is as a person, making a myth of Ebo and separating that from who Ebo is. The second opinion, yeah, the tipnis. So that's another example for people who want to see what is your opinion on how Ebo, the indigenous president, has treated the indigenous peoples of the tipnis when they protested against an auto route within their land. That was a very controversial point, and it is actually the reason why many indigenous people started to question Ebo. He started to move away from many of his policies of defending indigenous peoples 100%, and in some ways putting a divide between like many of the Quechuas and Aymaras, who are more closer to the government and towards like development, and the more lowland indigenous peoples who prioritize the security of their lands over development. I think Ebo was wrong to do that. I think Ebo should have engaged in much more prior informed and consensual discussions with the indigenous peoples before engaging with that type of development. And it's probably and it was hammered on hard by the right wing during the 2019 elections. Does that mean that Ebo should have been overthrown or anything like that because of that, because of the Tipnis incident in 2011? No. But does it show many of the contradictions of his presidency? Yes. And I think it shows many of the limitations of it as well, and why people were really hoping for figures like Felipe Quispe and Eva Copa to take power in La Paz and defeat the MAS. So the next question is, Arnold, what is your experience as an indigenous person in the US like? And in your opinion, what makes a person truly indigenous? I'll try to answer that. So being indigenous is a two-pronged thing. Thank you, Rob 101. It means being it's one, having a literal blood connection to being to an indigenous person, the same way as like any other racial group. Like you can't be Asian if if all of your family is from Ukraine or something, or all of my family. I can't claim to be German just because I learned the language. What it means is actually having that is being racially connected on some level there, like having blood. But that isn't the full aspect of being indigenous. It's also seeing yourself in relationship to a history of colonization, of understanding yourself as an indigenous person, because there are many people who are indigenous but see themselves as a Latino, as a mestizo. In our point in history, it's to recognize how we have a distinct history from Latin America, and how Latin America has a specific relationship towards erasing indigeneity, so as to quell any fears that they have that indigenous peoples will reclaim their land or call for specific rights or even just revolt because colonial abuses are bad no matter who does it, republics, plurinational states, or colony, or like or empires. But be that being said, as an indigenous person in the U.S., it's complicated because being indigenous requires um, understanding that there was much culture lost. Learning Quechua again. I was not born. I did not grow up learning Quechua. I learned English and Spanish. My dad speaks Quechua. My mom's dad, my grandpa, speaks Aymara. So on my maternal grandfather's side, I should know Aymara. But on my all of my dad's family knows Quechua, and just being able to access those resources are very difficult. But at the very least, it's recognizing being indigenous recognizes that I have a responsibility and also a history that I can't escape. It is the responsibility of knowing that there is a colonial structure that exists, but it's also the reality of why is my brown skin criminalized in a certain way, whereas other Latinos, other Latinxes, so to say, who are like light skinned, like Argentinians, maybe like white Chileans, even like blonde Mexicans, they won't be criminalized because they'll be considered white, they'll be considered European, whereas being Latinx as a like brown comes from that indigeneity, and that's the inescapable truth, whether or not you call yourself indigenous or not. That indigeneity is what causes colonial institutions to look at you, to mark you and say, now we've separated you, now we know what to do with you. um, so in essence, it's juggling all of those things, reclaiming all of the engaging and realizing all of the responsibilities I have and have to do, but also understanding that it's inescapable, and that at the very least, it grounds me to know that like whether or not like the debates that happen like, oh, you're not indigenous, you weren't born in the countryside, or you didn't grow up speaking Quechua and Aymara, or like you're Latino, like you're only your parents or grandparents could be indigenous. Well, at the very least, like you have to acknowledge that there's some type of violence, and how the hell are you going to take that, how the hell are you going to explain that? Where does my brownness that is criminalized come from? Well, 500 years before, or in my case, like my dad and my mom. So let's go to the next question. As someone who's starting to learn more about my indigenous roots, what are some articles or resources that you would recommend as someone who's starting out? I I do not have articles at the top of my head. I'm very sorry to everyone who's watching this right now. Um, if I would say there is just looking into the history of your country, looking into the history of the specific region that your family's from, asking family history. Sometimes the family stories know a lot more than many of the official histories do. Uh, mm, what was it? But there's no article that is a roadmap for this is how you become indigenous again. Actually, I would recommend looking up Hicha. They're a Bolivian Catarista website, and you should look up the books by Fausto Jainaga, specifically the book called El Pensamiento Amautico. I have a post on it actually on my Instagram, where it's a blue post, and it describes, and it's basically a dialogue that Fausto Jainaga has. He makes between an Indian and a mestizo, and Fausto Jainaga is saying, you mestizo can become indigenous again. We're welcoming you back in as long as you recognize that you were colonized and you have to get rid of it. And I would say that would be a good article to just justify that you can go on this journey. But there is no article that says, here is the checklist for how to fill out your indigeneity. Um, looking into those resources based on family, based on region, based on official histories, based on um, just what was it, conversations with other peoples. That's I think what would matter most. Also, I would recommend this book, The New World of Indigenous Resistance by Noam Chomsky and edited by Lois Mayer and Benjamin Maldonado Alvarado. It was a key text for me to learn how to, my indigeneity, how to learn indigenous history growing up. And it's somewhat accessible. It's kind of academic, but it is written by both academics and indigenous non-academics. So many of the articles are still accessible. To the next question, Hoyedi, based on our history and previous revolutionaries, how should we liberate ourselves from this post-apocalyptic world, or have any ideas to an alternate way of life that isn't colonial? I mean, one, that's a big responsibility for me to do. You're basically telling me be Lenin or someone. No, I don't have the answers. I don't think anyone who says they have all of the answers, they're kind of crazy. But I mean, sometimes they're right. What I would say is look into one, there just needs to be a better relationship to the environment. Two, there needs to be a massive curbing, if not a massive curbing to capitalism. We can't go on this path as it is now. We're not going to survive. But also recognizing that other European ideologies have their own flaws too, like Marxism. I'm no Marxist. What was it? I never. At some point I was, but then I was just like, no, this doesn't make sense. I was maybe a Marxist for like a year, and then I was like, no, this is BS, because it doesn't understand indigenous peoples. I'm no revolutionary either. Let me be clear about that. I don't believe an armed revolution is something we should do. I know there are going to be a lot of people who are angry about me with that, but come on. We're indigenous, but we also have many possibilities to just study our history, our cultures, and see what the examples that Bolivia has done, that Peru has done recently, that Ecuador has done with the Konai. They're studying these types of different indigenous philosophies. I would also recommend looking up Ciro Galvez. Looking up who else? Looking up David Choquehuanca, looking up Luis Ambaludi, Nina Pacari. I know there are problems with Nina Pacari, or also Leonidas Isa. Different indigenous figures in Andean society now that are describing how indigenous peoples have won in the past. But I'm not gonna go to some revolutionary route. I'm no revolutionary. I'm just an academic. I just write. I just read. That's about it. Omar Noyola, my question to Arnold is, when do you think that the total liberation of our land will happen? In the next 10, 20, 50, or 100 years? Couldn't tell you. But at the very least, what's interesting is that we're approaching the 500 years of Andean history, which is said to result in a Pachacuti. So after Atahualpa was beheaded in 1532 or 1533, I believe. But people mark 1532 as the end of the Inca Empire as its own independent force. So 500 years from now is 2032. We're only 11 years away. Who knows? Maybe there's going to be some prophetic shift that happens there. I couldn't tell you. All I know is that the Pachacuti is a valuable myth for how to, and a hope, a messianic hope, which is also a big theme in Andean history, that there will be something or someone that will come about and that will guide one to liberation in the Andean sense. And that maybe the Pachacuti will be good. There are also people who say the Pachacuti is bad. That the overturning of cultures and of established order can also result in very violent outcomes that in the pre-Inca world were floods and earthquakes that destroyed whole cities and established Andean communities. So I couldn't say, but the next 20 years are looking pretty good if we're looking at someone like Pedro Castillo, or these changes, these Latin American countries that are pushing towards plurinationalism, or in the US and Canada for land back. So I would say look into those.
Thank you very much, Arnold. I think that's going to be for the questions. There's more comments, and hopefully, when you get a chance, you could review, you could read the chat room yourself and
Yeah.
see all the ideas and comments people had. And for everyone that tuned in today, please make sure to follow Arnold's Instagram page on NewAmauta on Instagram, and also be ready for his course. He's preparing to have a course, which I don't know if you can share that one more time,
Yes, I will.
so that people can follow up with this. There's, as you can see, it's massive. So make sure to follow up with him for his class. It's going to be starting August 1st, and you can read the information there. But
Yes.
definitely, if you want to announce that one more time, just so that people can follow through.
Yes, of course. So, my classes will be 6 weeks, Andean philosophy from the same time period, about 1532 to 2021, of course, with the Inca anthropology as the first class. There will be classes of about an hour, 20 minutes each. So if this was like an hour 20, an hour 40, an hour 20 is going to, for each topic, will let us be able to go through each author very specifically, very detailedly, and even compare their distinct visions to each other. Um, and yeah, I'll be able to go into authors that I wasn't able to go into, different debates in indigenous philosophy. But session A will be in the mornings, so everyone can have their nice Sunday afternoons. But also Mondays will be at night, so working folks can actually come to class. And don't worry, there's not going to be homework. All you have to do is, if you want to read, you can read. If you don't have to. You can listen to the lectures. But it's here for you to just learn, for you to let me talk, but also for you to learn and not have to have a prior background to this knowledge. Because the thing about the diaspora is, we're starting from step 1 most of the time, and I'm hoping I can get you to step 10, with you just sitting back and enjoying the show of 500 years of our beautiful philosophical history, which most Europeans think we don't have, but I just proved them wrong. And please do
Absolutely.
check out Brian Arnett's design for he does beautiful designs like this. Ask him for a commission for hired work. This was a beautiful thing he did for me. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you again, Arnold, for sharing space with us, for sharing your time, your evening with us on a beautiful summer day. And I hope everyone enjoyed. Again, this class is available immediately after we're done. You can find it here on my YouTube channel. And make sure, again, follow his page. And also, I do have a Google form that I would love if you can please complete. You don't have to be super, detailed, just like perhaps some thoughts on the content, the approach. That always helps us as educators, to see how we can improve our approaches to the content and what we're teaching. So until next time, tune in for next month. It's going to be Saturday, July 31st at 12 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And I'm going to be doing the class in the Spanish language, which a lot of people have asked for. So gather your tias, your tios, everyone that has been asking for that. I'm really excited about that. So again, Arnold, thank you so much for contributing to E-Decolonize. Everyone, please stay tuned for next month and follow his account. If you're interested in the course, the costs and all that, make sure to message him on NewAmauta on Instagram. So until then, thank you very much. Everyone, enjoy the rest of your beautiful weekend. Take care.
Agradezco, Iquichek. Thank you so much, y'all.